preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
To all of you who are brave enough to anticipate that you were not going to melt in this evening's rain, I'd like to welcome you to part 3 of this program, which was intended to be provocatively entitled Nearsighted Visions of Redemption. And that was a question, not a presumption. Nevertheless, each one of these talks has examined the thinking and the products of the thought of 3 great 19th century Jews, whose ideas then spawned major movements, mass movements, that attracted large numbers of Jews, and in some cases non-Jews as well. And then over the course of time, with varying degrees of success, either brought about a major change or were themselves changed so as not to precisely fulfill the vision of the original creator or the enthusiasts who first rallied to those banners. In previous weeks, we've looked at Marxist communism and at Freudian psychoanalysis, and this week we're going to look at Theodor Herzl and the founding of the Zionist movement. We're pleased to introduce to you tonight Professor Ben Halpern, a name who's known to anyone who has done any kind of reading in modern Zionist literature. His own education took place both at the undergraduate and doctoral level at Harvard University. And beginning in 1936, with his conclusion of his graduate work, he became earnestly involved with Zionist affairs and has continued with active involvement throughout the years. Among some of the most notable positions that he's held, among many, are as director of the Jewish Agency for Palestine from 1949 to 1956, and as professor of Near Eastern Studies at Brandeis University from 1968 to 1980. Professor Halpern is the author of The American Jew, a Zionist Analysis, The Idea of a Jewish State, published by Harvard University Press, and most recently, A Clash of Heroes, Brandeis, Weizmann, and American Zionism. The format for the evening is, after Professor Halpern makes his opening presentation, we will then engage in a dialogue pursuing some of the ideas brought forth, and then I'll also turn it open to you, the audience, and give you an opportunity to ask questions or pose further matters for our consideration. Once again, won't you welcome Professor Halpern.
Can you hear me all right? It works? Okay. As I am myself nearsighted, so I think if I had to suggest a title for this series, I would have said The Far-Sighted Utopians, which is not necessarily a recommendation, because if you're farsighted, you trip over what's under your nose. That's really what's wrong with most utopias. But I gather that one is not expected to be guided strictly by the title. As it happens in the case of the person I'm going to deal with, Theodor Herzl, the title is appropriate. Much more so, I imagine, than with Freud or Marx. I'm not aware that either Freud or Marx ever wrote a utopia. They may have, but just because I'm not aware of it probably is no proof. But it is true that I'm not aware of that. Whereas Herzl, you know what I did? I left my notes in my other coat.
No,
leave them.
You sure?
As with Herzl, he wrote 2 major works on Zionism. One is Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and the other is a book called Alt Neuland. Now, the Jewish state begins with an introduction in which he deals with utopians, with a number of people who wrote utopias, and explains that what he is writing in the Jewish state may seem like a utopia, but it isn't a utopia. And then, very soon after that, within a matter of a few years, he sat down and wrote a novel which is cast in the form of utopia, and explicitly did so. In fact, he was advised before he wrote the pamphlet, The Jewish State, that it might be a good idea to write it as a novel, a utopian novel, because that would appeal to people. Well, I'm not sure that that was good advice, because nobody that I know of who doesn't have to reads the Alt Neuland, his utopian novel. I'm not so sure that how many people read the Jewish State, but certainly more than have read Alt Neuland. Now, in both of these books, and particularly in The Jewish State, Herzl takes pains to argue that he is not speaking in unreal terms, that what he is putting forth is based on realities. And this is true of both his pamphlet, The Jewish State, which is an explicit program for how to bring about the creation of a Jewish state and the transport of masses of Jews to live there. Equally true of his novel, the utopian novel, which he says introduces nothing which does not already exist, but simply applies the technical knowledge and the social theoretical principles current in his time to the situation of the Jews who would come to Palestine. So he makes a strong plea for being considered a realist, even in writing a utopia. Now, he also argues, in the same vein as Marxists, that his plan for the prognosis of history and for the creation of a better state of society, of a better condition for Jews, is based on an analysis of the historical necessities of the situation that faced the Jews in the world in his day. It is inevitable, as it was inevitable that socialism should emerge for Marx from the collapse of capitalism, so it was inevitable for Herzl that Zionism should prevail as a solution of the Jewish problem that he analyzed. Inevitability in both cases meant, however, not that it was going to happen automatically. What was historically inevitable was the appropriate solution for a problem that existed. If the solution did not come about, the problem would not be solved, would persist. And only if measures were taken to bring about the rational solution of the contradictions of capitalism in the case of Marx and the anomalies of the Jewish situation in the case of Herzl, would a solution be possible. So what was historically inevitable would only come about provided somebody did something about it. So Herzl's writings fall into two parts. First, there is the rational analysis of a problem and the diagnosis of its inevitable solution, then there is a propaganda and a program for arousing the necessary enthusiasm required to bring about the rational solution. And Herzl, as a journalist and a writer, was aware of that side of the problem as of the other. Now, you're going to tell me when it's about half an hour, right?
Sure.
Okay. After the first Zionist Congress, which took place in 1897, Theodor Herzl wrote in his diary, "Today I have founded the Jewish state. If I said it today, people would think I was foolish." Those are not his exact words. He phrased it a little better than that. But 50 years from now, everybody will see that it was so. 50 years later to the day, there was a Jewish state. So this was a utopian whose main objective was carried out on schedule. But of course, that's nonsense. That was just a phrase. He didn't seriously mean it. And as a matter of fact, the Altneuland, which is his novel about the reality of the Jewish state, which was to solve the Jewish problem, is located not 50 years from, well, in this case, not 97, but from 92, but 20 years later. The hero, I guess 94 is what he had in mind. The hero of this novel is a young man disappointed in love, afflicted with Weltschmerz, and also suffering from the special Jewish problem, who decides that he's going to abandon the world, and he goes off with a Prussian Junker who has similar difficulties. They live in a desert island for 20 years. Before they leave, they visit Israel, Palestine, and see it as it existed then. 20 years later, they decide to come back and make another visit to Israel, and what they see is the solution to the Jewish problem, the Jewish state in existence. Now, what did Herzl mean by a state? This is a very murky issue, because at one point he says, what I have in mind is a community that would be defended by its own army. And then in the Judenstaat, he also says that the Jewish state that will arise, which would be an autonomous province, well, that came later, but he didn't specify the independence. Nevertheless, it would be protected externally and policed internally by its own armed force. But when you read the Judenstaat, when you read Altneuland, he's come back to Palestine 20 years after having seen it around 1894, and he sees a society which has no army. The army doesn't exist. There is no state. It exists without a state. What does he envisage? This society is going to be constructed, as he says, on the principle of mutualism. That is a kind of an intermediate state of society between capitalism and socialism. And it is based on cooperative, entrepreneurial groups who don't need a state. And the land is owned collectively. It is held on long-term leases. by the groups organized in cooperatives. Every 50 years, in the Jubilee year, using an old Jewish tradition, you get a reassessment of the land, and whatever increase in value that real estate has acquired goes to the state. Not to the state, to the cooperative society and its governing board. If one asks, did this utopia come about? Well, the answer is, to a great extent, it did. At least until 1948. Or at least until Ben-Gurion decided to transfer the center of gravity of the Zionist movement from the cooperative setup to the state. And of course, to a great extent, it hasn't. But it didn't do too badly as a utopia. But this too is not to be taken seriously, because this is a kind of a propaganda appeal of Herzl's. It is not in his operational plan. In fact, his operational plan is devoted strictly to achieving the legal requirements for beginning to create the Jewish state, for bringing people over. Now, here too, he has a utopian scheme. I'll go from the less pertinent to the more pertinent aspects of it in series. How's it going to be financed? We're going to transfer masses of Jews to a country that has no really visible resources. Whatever resources it has in the way of water power, for example, would have to be developed by the use of major investments and the application of the most advanced technology of the time. So there's a lot of money involved. In the Jewish state, the plan is that Jewish capital will be liquidated in countries from which Jews are to leave, handed over to an organization, the Jewish Company, which will transfer the funds for investment in Palestine and in this way transfer credits for the immigrants. In Alt-Neuland, the picture is a little different. In Alt-Neuland, there are three sources that are going to finance this major enterprise. First, there are some, I forget the exact amount, but something like 20 million pounds of Jewish philanthropic money. He's thinking of the Baron de Hirsch Fund and the Jewish Colonization Association and Rothschild's money and the money raised by German Jews for the relief of Russians. All that will be made available for this rational solution of the Jewish problem. Secondly, once people start moving, all the department store owners in England, Germany, are going to see that there's a market. So they'll all establish depots, warehouses in Haifa, and finance the transfer of goods that way. And then thirdly, after the thing has been going for a while, the cooperative settlements will become creditworthy, and they'll be able to leverage their effort by their credit. Well, all this utopia, in a way, took place, but not at all in the tempo that would be required for a smooth solution of the Jewish problem, such as Herzl implied. In fact, it was a very arduous, difficult thing involved with failures, shortcomings, and sacrifices of the people involved all the way. But It more or less describes how Palestine was built. What he takes most seriously is his scheme for dealing with the Jewish problem as an international concern. And this is what he was really, this is his far-sighted plan, which tripped over obstacles immediately under his nose that in his farsightedness he didn't see. The scheme is simple. The Jewish problem is a problem for Jews and for Gentiles. For Jews, it is a problem summed up in the experience of anti-Semitism. In its two forms. In the form in which it exists in Russia or Romania, where Jews are harried, tormented, driven out, and in the form in which it exists in Western Europe, where Jews, and particularly Jewish intellectuals, find themselves excluded from the final acceptance. He says, we are a people, one people. And why are we a people? Because, as Sartre said, they won't let us be otherwise. We were ready to come out of the ghetto, at least we people in Vienna and Germany, and be assimilated, but this is not given us. We're not permitted. We are subject to insults and humiliations. Consequently, you've got two sources that can be raised to enthusiasm for transport to Palestine. On the one hand, the driven masses of Eastern Europe, but on the other hand, the young, unemployed intellectuals of Western Europe, Western and Central Europe. And the order would be something like this. You have all this money at hand. As soon as you convince people of the rationality of the scheme, they'll be ready to invest it according to his proposals. This will then offer employment for all kinds of Jewish engineers, lawyers, doctors, accountants, who will construct the plan upon which a cooperative society can be built, and then that would provide for the masses who are driven and have nowhere else to go, where they can go without producing anti-Semitism in their train. That's the Jewish side of the equation. On the Gentile side, this is going to relieve all Gentile societies of a problem that's embarrassing and difficult for them. It's good for them. He says, I'm aware of all the complex motives of anti-Semitism. Religious prejudice, economic jealousy, social antipathy. But I understand these people and I can talk to them. And if one offers them an honorable and effective solution, such as reducing the number of Jews in their country to the point where they become tolerable, they will cooperate. Therefore, I am proposing a public discussion of this issue as one of common concern to Jews and Gentiles alike. What I am setting up is not a secret conspiracy like the well-known elders of Zion, who became well-known a little after this, but or the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was assumed to be the same type of organization, operating behind the scenes. This is a public proposal which can be negotiated with intelligent anti-Semites and can be sold and made and arouse enthusiasm among Jews, and it is the inevitable solution of this problem, the only one that will work. Well, that of course was what he didn't see. Neither was he able to he did arouse enthusiasm immediately and was considered a messianic figure. But the Zionist organization itself never really profited very much from this. Did not become in his day a major force. It succeeded in gaining attention. He had no success with selling his rational scheme to anyone who was of importance to him on the Gentile side. Neither to the Germans, nor to the Russians, nor even to the British, although he had more success there for a while, when he was offered what was called Uganda. Nor to the Arabs, nor to the Turks. And we all know what happened. And what shortcomings and obstacles afflicted the construction of the society and the economy in Palestine that he foresaw in such a bright light also goes back to the failure to get a rational acceptance of his scheme by those who had to accept it to make it possible. I don't suppose that's surprising to anybody who lives in these days. The expectation that anybody would really behave rationally about any social problem in terms of a simple, least common denominator analysis of it is utopian, in the sense of blindness to what lies under one's nose. So the Zionist project that Herzl initiated, or at least took over and gave an impetus to, achieved a great deal. Some of the things it achieved were not in his plan at all, like the revival of the Hebrew language. There was a whole other set of Zionists with their dreams. It achieved a great deal along his lines, too, but stumbled over the simple misunderstanding of human nature that might have been characteristic of his time in history, but was certainly characteristic of him. I'll stop here for the...
Thank you. Please have a seat. I would like to say before we start talking about some of these ideas that I am a card-carrying Zionist, and if along the way, however, it sounds as though I'm playing devil's advocate, it's only because I think that these are important questions in light of the series that we're discussing here. The first thing I'd like to talk about is Herzl made certain assumptions about the necessity for a Jewish state, and I'm wondering, in your light of reading the history of the time and what has come about, whether you feel those assumptions are still valid for today. Let's take them one at a time. Are the Jews an indigestible minority in the Western world and Western culture? If you like, maybe you can move in a little bit or bring this around toward you.
Well, see, I'm committed to the position that they are. I once wrote a book, 30 years ago, which, well, no, not that long, which spoke of America's two classic minorities, the Jews and the blacks, and what was classic about them was that they were unassimilable as compared with anybody else. Now, that was based on not Herzl's assumptions. He simply says that When we got out of the ghetto, we came out as a bourgeois people, and as a bourgeois people, we were in competition with Gentiles, and therefore they can't accept this, they won't accept this. That's his analysis. My assumption was that the fact that the Jews are a unique, religiously defined group, Jews are Judaists, even if they're not Judaists, they are not anything else, and as long as they're not converted, they remain Jews. Put it in a formulaic form, to become a Gentile, you have to become a Christian first, or maybe a Muslim, and even then it takes another generation. And if you become converted to Judaism, then you have stopped being a goy. You become a Jew, even a son of Abraham. So this is a barrier, I think, which is impossible to break. Now, that was 30 years ago. Things have changed a little since. We have a heavy proportion of intermarried Jews, which means that in their intimate relationships, they have relatives who are Christians and relatives who are Jews in the same family. So they have options. They can go one way or the other, or ban them both. If that barrier is made more permeable, and if the Jewish establishment does what I think they might well do, accept as Jews anybody who says he's a Jew. If his father was a Jew, he's a Jew. Many of the barriers, well, at least the particular form of barrier that existed before this wave of intermarriage are lowered. And the difference between Jew and Gentile becomes diluted.
Well, just to look at recent American history, if a Jew can marry a Kennedy and a Jew can marry a Cuomo, that certainly doesn't seem like an unassimilable minority. Is anti-Semitism an endemic and incurable disease wherever Jews are a minority? Second platform of Herzl's plank there.
Well,
plank
let
platform.
me finish my remarks on the first question.
All right.
I say, in spite of that, in spite of the fact that barriers are lower, it's not a way in which you can assimilate the Jews. Some Jews can pass out of the community. It's not so easy to pass out of the community, especially after it becomes diluted, because nobody knows who is a Jew anymore. But nevertheless, some people can become Gentiles. That still leaves a block who are Jewish, and they remain in the same position as before. Now, as to anti-Semitism. Now here, Herzl's view was that anti-Semitism is complex causes. Essentially, it's a permanent fact. He doesn't go into too much analysis, but he accepts it as a permanent fact of Jewish life, as long as Jews live as strangers among Gentiles. And the way in which anti-Semitism will disappear is if they have a home of their own, and reduce their number as strangers among Gentiles to the point that can be assimilated. Now, that was an assumption that didn't work out. Jews are concentrated in Palestine. Anti-Semitism didn't disappear. In fact, it's now focused on Israel. Also, it's true that Herzl might argue that the number of Jews who remain in other people's lands has not been reduced to the number that could be easily assimilated. Of course, the difficulty with that is that they were reduced to that number in Poland and didn't stop Poles from being anti-Semites immediately after the war. Nevertheless, it's my assumption that anti-Semitism is a permanent relationship of Jews and Gentiles. It's rooted in the religious difference, and as long as that exists, there will be anti-Semitism. And therefore, creating a Jewish homeland doesn't help in that respect, but anti-Semitism in that sense, and I like to spell it without a hyphen and without a capital letter, because it's not the kind of thing that arose when Jews were declared to be a racial type. It goes back to the beginning of Judaism. That kind of thing is not something we have to worry about. It's something one can live with. And one has to live with, because if anti-Semitism is related to the opposition between one group defined by one religious attitude and another defined by a different one, and if this includes people who have no religious attitudes at all, but are socially connected with a religiously defined group, then so long as that religious difference exists, there will be this antagonism. And it's always, if one had to get rid of it, you'd have to get rid of Jews. So it's the price of being Jewish, and as long as it goes with an acceptable degree of tolerance, as it has for centuries past, then one shouldn't even want to get rid of it. When it becomes a problem is when Jew hatred has as its target a kind of equilibrium point of acceptance, rejection on both sides between Jews and Gentiles that has been institutionalized in society and agreed to by both sides. And that's a variable quantity. In the medieval times, it was an acceptance on both sides that Jews were undergoing penance in exile for their sins, which was interpreted in different ways by Jews and Gentiles, but nevertheless there was this agreement. In modern times, that is post-emancipation, it's an acceptance by both sides that citizenship is common without reference to religion. Religion is a private matter. If that kind of understanding is under attack, as it was with the Nazis, now that is a kind of anti-Semitism that cannot be accepted. It has to be fought, and for which Palestine was, the Zionist movement was an answer, not the only one, but one. And I think probably the most effective, because the other answer is the effort to convince Gentiles that they don't have privileged access to theological truth, that there are other people with equal access. Now, some Gentiles will accept that, but if you're going to try to solve a problem like the Jewish problem on the basis of universal acceptance of that principle, I think one is entitled to expect all kinds of things like the recent flap over the convent in Auschwitz, and one shouldn't be surprised at that. Well, okay.
What about the third platform, that the other alternative, that for Jews to preserve themselves and their descendants as Jews, it is necessary then for them to live in a Jewish state, the other alternative being to dissolve among the nations?
Well, again, let's see. Here,
do you see any exceptions to that?
No, I don't. I think Herzl was mistaken. Let's see. His program was that massive Jews would settle in Palestine. That would leave behind a few who didn't want to. They could be assimilated. Of course, the trouble is they're not assimilated, and I don't think Jews are assimilable as a group. Mm-hmm. And I think I lost the thread. What was it?
Whether it's necessary for Jews, if they're going to preserve themselves as a community, to have their own state.
The consequence is the Jews can't help surviving as a community. It's not necessarily something that they have to program. They're Jews in spite of themselves, a good many of us. The problem with that is it's not a very ennobling or pleasant kind of existence. The way that most people deal with it is by regarding the Jewishness of their life as a triviality, a formality. Occasionally, one is unable to do this because it becomes a serious matter. But even if one deals with it in that way, that's neither ennobling nor pleasant. And since the definition of being a Jew in the diaspora is adherence to some kind of religious solidarity, it is not acceptable, except by demeaning compromise. Most people don't have any problems with demeaning compromise. Most of our lives as we grow up are made up of making demeaning compromises in all kinds of ways. But young people, and sensitive young people particularly, run into this and run off into cults or become Zionists or become ultra-Orthodox Jews or drug addicts. And we're going to see that kind of thing over and over again for all kinds of reasons, not related solely to the state of the Jewish community, but also because of the nature of the Jewish survival, malgré soi, malgré gloire, whether you want it or not. There was once, many years ago, a group set up in New York called, oh, I forget what. Today it would be called alternative education. The principle was that since the children of these Jewish communities were going to be Jews willy-nilly, whether they liked it or not, you should set up an educational system that would make them like it, make it be easy. Difficulty is that if your Jewish identity ultimately goes back to kind of religious commitment, there's no way to make it easy. It has to be serious. And if it can't, then it's going to be a fact, an existential fate, for which the most sensitive find themselves compelled to seek justifications. In Israel, you don't have to do that.
Obviously, no one could have anticipated in 1900, turn of the century, what the United States of America would become as such a heterogeneous community in which the relevance of the Jewish question was almost overshadowed by the continuous patchwork quilt quality of the community, so that without the strong nationalisms and the uniformity of religious life on the part of the so-called dominant majority, the Jewish question never really came up to the level at which it came up in any European society or any medieval society that we know of. Is the United States a proof that Herzl was wrong about the only alternatives that existed for Jews?
Well, the question is, what do you mean by an alternative? Is it an alternative that you can take pride in, take pleasure in? Well, as you know, as you probably guess, I don't particularly. I don't particularly like this alternative. Mm-hmm. I don't like to say this, because it doesn't help get an audience very much. And also I'm aware that what happens when you're living in this alternative is that you get a kind of a search for religious authenticity that is going on not only by way of going into cults, but also in the Jewish community. And you get kind of a thriving theology. Doesn't help me because I don't get much comfort out of theology, but there is a drive toward that. This was not foreseen by Herzl, nor was Herzl at all in touch with what goes on in America at all. As a matter of fact, his statements about America were pretty much confined to the view that by 1895, when he wrote the Jewish state, Jewish immigration had already caused anti-Semitism in America. So he didn't have to talk about it anymore. And anti-Semitism always has the same outcome. You get driven out. Well, there was evidence in our immigration laws of a particular animus against Jews in America and in England. But the situation in which Jews found themselves in America was not the kind that leads to being driven out. It just leads to exclusionary acts and so on. And even those, in terms of discrimination in jobs, have kind of washed away to a great extent since the Second World War. So that conclusion was not warranted. To say that this is an alternative means that you are driven into the position of saying that America is Babylon or Alexandria. The Israelis like to say Alexandria. The Americans like to say Babylon. Well, the evidence for that is you have Jewish studies in the universities, something to which I dedicated some time. By the way, when I worked for the Jewish Agency, I was associate director of a department of culture and education, and sometimes of publications, not of the whole enterprise. But okay, so that's a good thing. But does this make us Babylon? I'm very dubious.
Well, I'd like to give some other people an opportunity and share the wealth. Please, go ahead, sir.
Well, I enjoyed your story about the Prussian Junker and the Jewish fellow. I've known some German-American women who thought they were Zionists or were spoofing Zionists or had spoofed Zionism so hard that they became Zionists themselves. So I don't think the story is entirely without merit for the society in the post-war world. I don't know much about the state of Israel, the reality there. I could surmise this or I could surmise that, and there are a lot of certainly, with the problem of communism or the decline of communism in Eastern Europe, one could surmise all kinds of things about a future Jewish reality in the old world. But I'd like to relate to your statement about assimilation. And I had a very strange experience last summer. I went to a small town in Maine, which had once been the economic capital of Maine, and now has one very large blue-collar industry and not much else except a kind of touristy Main Street that has a commercial district 3 blocks long. And on that street, there was a Povich's men's clothing store, and there were 2 other businesses which had names which I think one would conclude were Jewish, Jewish identity with some of these businesses very much up front. I don't know if that was put on for my benefit or not, whether it was some kind of Potemkin village, but there seemed to be three large businesses which were unmistakably Jewish, and in this town, there really was no room to breathe. I mean, these people, if they
Are you going to get to a question?
I'm just
Okay.
these people, if indeed they were Jewish, were both unmistakably Jewish and so hemmed in that they had to be, in some sense, assimilated because there's no room to breathe. Now, I wonder, in looking at this, how, at a situation like this, what makes you say that Jews are unassimilable in America when one looks at a small town like this?
Jews is a collective noun and Jews is a distributive plural. Now, Jews, taking individually, of course are assimilable. You want to pass as a Gentile, there's no difficulty in doing it. That doesn't help the Jews as a collective entity. When I say Jews are unassimilable in America, I mean there is a Jewish body which is unassimilable. Mm-hmm. And, once during the last war, a very fine man, what was his name? He was very active in rescuing Jews out of the French concentration camps.
Wallenberg?
Who?
Wallenberg.
No, not Wallenberg. That was in Hungary. He worked at the American Friends. Whatever his name was. He once wrote an article for a journal I was editing, which we printed, in which he said the situation facing these Jewish refugees in Gurs or in Drancy or in the other concentration camps in Vichy just before the Nazis took over was so desperate, and he was the man who was trying to get them out heroically, that in fact he saw no other way out for them except to assimilate. Convert and assimilate. And at that time there were plenty of Jews in Hungary and elsewhere who had the same view. Okay, that would take care of a few people. Sometimes they had trouble even after conversion. But if you were going to do it for the mass, I had to print that paper because we commissioned it. The only way we could print it was by printing an answer, so I wrote an answer. How would you go about it if you wanted to assimilate the Jews as a mass? Well, one way is forced conversion, with the alternative of expulsion, as happened in Spain. That was pretty effective, except that the Marranos afterwards were treated as Jews, even after they became converts. But they could disappear if they took appropriate measures. The other way would be by setting up a scheme. If you were, let's say, Stalin wanted to do this, you might do it, to distribute the Jews evenly in accordance with their proportion in the population at large, all across the demographic and geographic map of Europe, so that they wouldn't be concentrated in such a way and it'd be easier to assimilate them. In both cases, Jews could perhaps be assimilated by somewhat the same methods that were used to exterminate them. That is, by totalitarian police methods. If you had liberty and freedom of choice, the bulk of the Jewish body is not going to be assimilated. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm saying. Individual Jews can do it much more easily than blacks, because it's awfully hard to tell who is or who isn't a Jew, even among Jews. The bulk of the Jewish community in a free society is unassimilable. Still, in spite of the changes that have taken place in the last 30 years in the ways of intermarriage and the dropping of barriers of discrimination and so on. Jews cluster and Jews go to synagogues, and they are therefore a body distinct from the ruling consensus of this country.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Cudahy.
I'd like to take the liberty of asking you to put your mind back to your own youth and ask you about your time at Harvard. What was it like for a young shaver like you way back then? Did you coagulate with a group? Was the Menorah Journal something to associate with? Was it too reform for you? Did you visit Harry Wolfson and Widener? What did you do with yourself? Draw up a kind of accounting, a double entry thing. What were the pluses of Harvard and what were the minuses as you look back?
Well, that's a long story. Look, in the first place,
I'd love a hunk of that story.
I don't think that my experience was representative, but nevertheless,
That's why I want it.
First of all, I was a commuter, right? That meant I didn't live in the houses. I experienced Harvard as a kind of a, it was sandwiched in between subway rides coming and subway rides going, and in addition, I went to the Hebrew Teachers College simultaneously. All right, when I went to Harvard, the people with whom I associated, apart from those in my own department, were others like me who came up by way of Latin school. They didn't go to the Hebrew College in most cases, and we were all commuters. We ate at a place called Dudley House, which was set up for us. We brought brown bags, and we ran back and forth to home. Now, Menorah Society was the treif, as far as we were concerned, you know. So we were all members of a VUCA, at least I was, which is a Zionist group. Harry Wolfson became the advisor to all such Jewish students, and he was also, in a sense, my thesis director when I wrote a dissertation for a doctorate. And that was only because I was in sociology, he was in Semitics. There was nobody in the department that could guide a dissertation on. I was going to call it Sociology of the Ghetto, but they wouldn't let me get a doctorate under that title. At that time, there was a young man named Bob Merton, who was a fellow student, and we happened to be talking, and he said to me, if you're having difficulty with titles, then there's one sure way to handle it. You call your dissertation Certain Sociological Aspects. Later I found out that that's what had happened to his dissertation too. Anyway, so my dissertation was on certain sociological aspects of the Jewish problem in Christian Europe prior to the 19th century. And for this, there was nobody in the department who could do anything, so Wolfson nominally was my... Look, I identified with an imaginary Harvard, which had considerable grounds to support the image. The Harvard I identified with was a WASP Harvard, WASP being not Southern Cavaliers, but New England Puritans who were Unitarian Universalists, abolitionists, favor of free speech, all other good things. That was not Harvard reality that I ran into. And to the degree that it was not, that was a disillusioning experience. Not anti-Semitism, although later I've been told that I should have noticed it, told by friends who are not Jewish, that things that I didn't pay much attention to, didn't really penetrate, should have been perceived by me as being anti-Semitic. But that was not it. It was the degree to which Harvard fell short of what it ought to have been if it would be true to itself as we conceived it. Being a Zionist was a different thing. That was a kind of a natural growth from childhood. As a matter of fact, as I grow older, keep trying to identify where I belong in terms of generations. So I belong to the generation of 1905. I hadn't been born yet, but that's the generation I identify with. That means the Russian Revolution, 1905, the immigrants who came here at that time, and the second Aliyah in Israel. Now that didn't come out of Harvard or Latin school. That came out of the Hebrew Teachers College and my home. And that was a sturdy growth that throve in an environment that didn't understand it at all and which didn't have any impact. The fact that nobody knew why we were doing the things that we were doing didn't bother us. But we did them anyway.
Yes, sir, in the back.
I really don't understand why there's so much focus on this unassimilability of the Jews in this country, in this conversation. You mentioned the blacks. There are very clear-cut Catholic streams that run through our society. Polish stream. You've got a lady who just bought the city of Gdansk practically because of her feeling about her Polish origin. We're a country that's made up of unassimilable groups, not just Jews and blacks, Polacks and Swedes and Germans and lots of other people. And depending on what part of the country you're in, you'll find a different dominant group. As a matter of fact, the Harvard you're describing, I know almost nothing about Harvard except what I read in the newspaper, isn't as waspy as it was when you went to Harvard. It's full of Jews today. It's full of Jewish teachers and Jewish professors and students. There are those who might say it's even a Jewish institution today. So things change. And I don't understand your turmoil, your concern over the unassimilability. Isn't that something to be proud of? The uniqueness of America is that it has made it possible to continue to have relationships with your roots and be an American simultaneously. And I didn't use the word hyphenated because I don't believe in hyphenated Americans. But I can be a Jew and an American, or a Polak and an American, or a Catholic and an American. So what?
Well,
people seem to do everything that's possible to defy intellectuals.
Okay.
okay. Yeah, well, look, that's another one of the reasons why, as I said, what I was saying 30 years ago was not so easy to say today, but I still continue to say it. You see, 30 years ago, I was working on the assumption that there's a rigid religious barrier. It's not so rigid. 30 years ago, this I would still say. 30 years ago, pluralism was not as acceptable as it is today. 100% Americanism was not necessarily there were some people who thought it was a bad word, but others didn't hesitate to call themselves 100% American, which meant that if you were a Pole or an Irishman or whatever, that's temporary. You can do that as long as you want, but you're not part of the real America. You're not part of what is nowadays called the civil religion of America. You may be accepted, particularly in the trivial contributions you make to America, like the jazz music for the blacks, Jewish comics for the Jews, Polish jokes for the Poles. and St. Patrick's Day parades for the Irish. Now, so that is no longer true. Now there's a kind of...
Even true 30 years ago.
Oh yeah, it was true enough.
Pluralist tradition, you and I are not very much different in age.
Yeah, I know.
I tell you, I'm not of the 1905 generation. When I was brought up in the 30s, we gloried in pluralism. We took a great deal of pride in that fact. I don't know, I went to Columbia, which was as anti-Semitic a hotbed as you could find with Nicholas Murray Butler. So now you've got a Jewish president of the university, a Jewish president of the college, and a Jewish dean of the law school.
Yeah, well, look, I won't argue the point of what happened 30 years ago because we're talking about today. Certainly today, it is less true than it was, however true it was then. Today, there's this kind of celebration of pluralism. And as I say, that makes it a little more difficult, I suppose, to defend the position I'm taking than it would have been 30, 40 years ago. But I still defend it. And there's a distinction between the Jewish difference and the Polish difference or the Irish difference. The Jewish difference and the black difference, and nowadays you might add a few, the Hispanic difference, the Chinese difference, are different differences from the others. Now, to take specifically the Poles, Irish, Norwegians, Italians, whatever you like. They have a zone of assimilation, not just they're all Catholic. And they are acceptable within that sphere. As a matter of fact, the one who was right on this point was our old friend Will Herberg. There's a Catholic America, there's a Protestant America, there's a Jewish America in terms of religious division. And the Catholic America and the Protestant America have a number of ethnic elements that have something in common, that have a consensus that can unite them. And all of them together have a Christian consensus that can unite them, which Jews do not share. No matter how many Christmas trees you put up in your homes, you don't share it. There's nobody who shares with the Jews what the Jews have except the Jews, if they have it. Even if they don't have it, it distinguishes them. That's a difference. Now, secondly, during the time of the celebration of pluralism, some of my friends and critics, good friends, tried to argue with me that we ought here in the United States to put on a campaign, we Jews, similar to what we did in Russia and Lithuania, for a minorities' rights status, like the one the blacks and the Hispanics fight for. Yiddish or Hebrew should be taught in the schools. We should have well, maybe, I don't know if they went this far, we should have a representative Jewish council that controlled our linguistic and cultural difference with tax support, because that was in the wind. People were making these claims for other entities, for other ethnic groups. Now, the difficulty is that this kind of claim can only be made on two assumptions, alternatives. Either you're an underprivileged group, and therefore you're entitled to organize and to demand compensations, including self-governing institutions of a sort. Or, as in the case of the Hispanics, you have a kind of territorial claim on places like New Mexico, where you have a dense population Spanish-speaking. If you're an affluent group like the Jews, whose real interest is to become accepted in America as the Episcopalians are accepted, that is to be allowed to be an elite group and have this accepted as natural, then you cannot at the same time claim a kind of publicly supported pluralist exceptionalism from America. The most you can do is build on the inescapable exceptionalism that you have whether you like it or not, and try to make the best of it. Now, some people can do this with enthusiasm, others not. And one has to distinguish between doing it with a kind of resentful pride and doing it with an authentic pride. Because if you want to do it with an authentic pride, then you have to do it in terms of recapturing a religious tradition and a culture that doesn't exist in America, except among people who went to all-day schools and then go on to teach at the Judaic programs in the universities. The bulk of American Jews culturally has nothing to be proud of as Jews.
Well, all right. I don't want it to devolve into a personal dialogue. I'm sure Professor Halpern will be glad to stay and chat with you after. I'd like to bring it back to, again, the original vision of Herzl, if I might. Herzl envisioned the creation of a Jewish state. And to that extent, the Herzlian Zionist dream was a monumental success. As you've already pointed out, within 50 years of his death, there it was, a reality on the map with a population and so on, all the rest. A second part of it, though, was certainly the vision of Aliyah, that significant numbers of Jews would flock to the land when given the opportunity. If I remember correctly, he always saw it as an ascent by classes, insofar as those people who were the worst off would go first, and they would probably be the most destitute in the lands that they were in which they were tyrannized, and so on and so forth. And then a second class that would go would be that middle group of intellectuals, the upper bourgeois.
Really the reverse, I think.
You know, that kind of thing. Well, I don't know. There were two different models, I guess, perhaps described. But my point is that really that's the part of it that has really been singularly unsuccessful in terms of the original plan. The only reason Jews go to Israel is if they're in trouble and can't go anywhere else, specifically can't get into the United States for a starter. But in terms of large numbers of enterprising Jews going to Israel with something other than the skins on their backs and a suitcase in their hands, that just hasn't been fulfilled. And there certainly were opportune times. In the 1920s, there was unrestricted immigration as far as the British were concerned, particularly after the Balfour Declaration had just been promulgated. And certainly for the last 40 years, absolutely nothing could have held Jews back who wanted to go to Israel. And yet, this upper class, and I don't mean financially upper class, I mean intellectually, creative, productive group of Jews are not going to Israel. What's wrong?
Well, there's nothing wrong. Just Herzl was mistaken.
Okay.
People don't move in accordance with his rational calculations, even when they wave flags in front of them, which was his other method. Or people move if they don't. He had a formula. Those who could not or would not assimilate. Well, I don't think that goes far enough. Those who could not hope to or would not wish to assimilate are the ones who move. Mm-hmm. And they move. That's a few. In countries where it becomes clear that there's no hope of assimilating, then those who move have options. They could move to Israel or Palestine or elsewhere. Now, when there was a mass immigration, relatively speaking, to Palestine, the reasons for that were, both in the 20s and in the 30s, that the other options of places to move to were closed. You couldn't get to America. You couldn't get eventually to Canada. You couldn't get to South Africa anymore. Couldn't get to Argentina. So people who couldn't hope to be, had no future at all where they were living and had to move to Palestine. There were also always those who did not wish to assimilate. Now each one had to be related to the situation in the country which he did not wish to assimilate to. A Jew who did not wish to become a Pole is in a different situation from a Jew who didn't wish to become an American Jew. Now there are a handful always of Jews in this country who don't wish to become standard American Jews. It's not so much the American Gentile that puts them off, it's the American Jew. I always used to feel that one of the best preparations for becoming an American chalutz was to have to work in a Jewish organization in America for sure. That could really prepare you for Aliyah. There were always a few like that. And it's for various reasons. At the time of the McCarthy affair, a number of Jewish communists used to go to Palestine. Time of the Depression, there were others who went. Now, since the state was established, it's particularly ultra-Orthodox Jews who are looking for something that they can't find in the standard American Jewish situation. That is a very small group, always. And it was that way in Russia as well. Those in Russia or Poland who went to Palestine on those grounds as a kind of a rejection of an alternative among Gentiles and a hope for another kind of life on their own were a small part of the group who went to Palestine from those countries. Just Herzl wasn't thinking in those terms.
Right.
Other Zionists were.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Cuddy.
One more of these autobiographical type things. Did the Jewish agency types ever point the finger at you and say, why haven't you made Aliyah? Were you ever tempted? And if so, why didn't you yield and go? I know that's a very personal question, but I'm asking.
It's a legitimate question, especially since my first job when I got out of school was as National Secretary of the American Chalutz Organization. I was tempted. I went to Israel. I went to Palestine before it was Israel. I went to Israel after it was Israel on, well, any number of occasions, 2 or 3 times at least, with a kind of a fading intention to stay there, to hope to stay there. And if I'm not there today, it's not because I didn't want to be, because I wasn't able to be. As for people pointing fingers, people didn't point fingers, because if they had to point fingers, there would be a lot of finger pointing. So,
Sure. To me, one of the saddest things is perhaps what you touched on, I think just obliquely along the way, of all the ironic twists of history and the unpredictable elements that have contributed to our saying at one point or another here this evening, well, Herzl was wrong, or Herzl was wrong, or Herzl was wrong. But I mean, ultimately, the idea that the Jewish state and the ingathering of the Jews to a central homeland was to have become the solution to the Jewish problem for Jews of the diaspora who were preyed upon by vicious enemies on every side. And instead, even though it has provided a haven for oppressed Jews from the diaspora, I can't think of a greater source of worry for the Jews of the diaspora than the Jews of Israel for the last 40 years. And the ironic twist on that, that, as you said, almost like the main focus of the anti-Semitism has been turned right back there into the Jewish homeland.
That is indisputable. The question is, how do you react to it? I'll give you another autobiographical item. During the war, what I did was work for 1 year for the American Jewish Committee's Institute. What was it called? The research, some kind of a committee on peace and post-war planning. And then for 4 or 5 years afterwards, for the Institute of Jewish Affairs of the American Jewish Congress and the World Jewish Congress. And what we did, I was an editor for them, what we did was receive reports, what was going on in Europe, and put out bulletins and studies, circulate them among opinion molders and legislators and the general public, in order to make people aware of what we knew as soon as we knew it, and propose what could be done. People didn't listen, and very few of the proposals got accepted. But what was most crushing about the whole experience was that we had our problems with our audience, that was nothing. But we were witnesses to what was going on, which was, well, as everybody knows what it was. What it, in particular, it was an experience of total helplessness. No matter what one did under those circumstances, you had to be guilty. And the only outlet at length was, let's say, the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, but this was a revolt like no other revolt in the world, except maybe Masada, or some, the Alamo, or I don't know what. It was a revolt with no hope of success, whose only function was to place in the hands of those who did the fighting the choice of the method of their own death. That was it. And this was a kind of horror to which the only answer is never again. That this must never be allowed to happen anymore. Not that Jews never again should be attacked or killed or hated, but they should never again be in the position that they could have no way out except to kill themselves, so that somebody should not kill them first. And if Israel today is the focus of a kind of a neo-anti-Semitism, there is first of all the fact that they can help themselves and do help themselves. And since they are able to help themselves, other people have to take them into account and even seek their alliance. Secondly, the fact that the hatred with which they are assaulted more and more has to be treated as the kind of rational hostility that Herzl hoped anti-Semitism was. It's a hatred with objective causes, objective reasons. And therefore it's a hatred that can be negotiated. It's a hatred that the Jews themselves can do something about. It's not a hatred that is arbitrary and for which they have no reply except to live with it as a fact of life, as an existential fate. And that is different. And that is sufficiently different for a person of my generation to place this in a separate category of Jewish existence.
I find that very thought-provoking and stimulating and an original way to look at it, and I'm grateful to you for that. I'd like to thank Professor Ben Halpern for being with us tonight, and those of you brave souls. And immediately as we adjourn from the stage here, we will come around in the lobby if anyone would like to spend a moment or two. By all means, continuing the chat with Professor Halpern. I'm sure he'll be glad to meet with you. Thanks once again for being here. Good night.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.